Hi everybody, we are starting now the tour of virtual tour of Castel Valentino. For that we have the help of our colleague Chiara Devoti, who is the director of the master in cultural heritage of this Politecnico di Torino. I thanks Chiara for her help, and please enjoy the tour.
Thank you very much, Beppe. It's a pleasure to be with you. We start from a very short visit of the Valentino Castle. That should be the place of the meeting. I don't know, unfortunately, probably somebody will not be able to be here, so we will try to give an idea of the place in which we stay. The Valentino Castle belongs to Politecnico di Torino since a long time. It was given in 1859 to be the seat for the Royal School of Application for Engineers, and then with the merge to the Museum of Industrial Activities in 1906, it became Politecnico di Torino. So it's why we consider totally the Valentino Castle to be our home. The palace, because at the beginning it was a fluvial residence, belonged to the royal family of Savoy and used like a sort of house of pleasure for short period during mainly the last spring, summer, and the beginning of autumn. The palace, as I was telling you, was formed by two portions, the lower area, in which we don't enter now, and the upper portion, which is the first noble floor, containing the official apartments. We will enter, since this door, the official apartments. This was not the way normally the court used to enter. They normally came on boat, so they used to float during their trip on the River Po. They reached the banks of the River Po, and they landed in this area. So we start. We entered the so-called golden apartments. It is very clear why the use of this term, because there is a quantity of gold on the stucco work. This gold is not strange to be found because it is a typical emblem of the condition of the commander, which was Christine of France, the first duchess coming here and using to live in this residence. She arrived from Paris in 1619 to be married to the heir, the future Vittorio Amedeo I, and she obtained this residence at the beginning as small, surely smallest than what we see nowadays, a small residence facing the River Po, because the residence was inserted in her wedding contract, and she asked it to transform into a sort of official residence in parallel to the main residence, which was in the center of the city, so the Ducal Palace, nowadays Royal Palace. And it is very interesting to enter this first room because this was the most official place. She requested a room to receive the ambassadors, having a sort of a parallel court in relation to the main court belonging to her husband. And this room is the place in which she used, as I was telling you, to receive. And so there is an allegory that you can perceive, treated by the series of putto. Putto is the term we use to define the young babies. Young babies distinguishing perfumes from the flowers, so giving the idea of a good management of the state. It is a very political room. It is also called Valentino room because of the ceiling, in which you can recognize there is the representation of the Valentino from the river with a sequence of garden never realized in fact, but that gives the idea of the complexities of the residence since the beginning. The residence was not accomplishing like what you see. There was just the central portion, while on the contrary, we have a lateral wing within bricks that you can see from the window, which was added during the 19th century, simulating the original drawing that we can see at the center of the ceiling, and also some representation, official representation, like the Teatrum Sabaudie, that you can see reproduced in the panel there, in which you see immediately that the building was bigger than what was really realized at the age of Christine of France. To receive the representation of the Teatrum Sabaudie, we also enter this small cabinet, being extremely emblematic. It is a typical beginning of the 17th century realization. It is all in stucco, as you can see, with the use of suspended mirrors. We know from the inventories that the mirrors were present since the beginning and that they were suspended by ribbons, exactly like what you can see. And the ribbons were suspended by a canthus scroll, giving the idea of a very aerial gazebo. It was a sort of filter between the inside and the outside of the residence, because at that time we don't have to image this double level we have nowadays of the apartment. There were enormous terraces, like what you can see again from the representation, and the terraces were facing directly on the private gardens. So the gazebo was really a filter between what was inside, we are in this tower, and what was outside, represented by the gardens itself. We have also the only remaining original floor, as you can see. It is a floor directly realized during the quarry. And as you can see, it is composed again by brick powder, and then it is all decorated and painted to simulate tiles. It is one of the only original 17th century floor existing, not only in Turin, but in general in north of Italy. Qui c'è il direttore. Prova. This is on the contrary the so-called lily room. You immediately understand the origin of the name, the quantity of lily being a very emblematic representation, not only the lily because a feminine element, but the lily again like a heraldical element. Something representing the origin and the French origin of Christine of France, the lily. Okay. We make a short variation. I was describing you the lily room and telling you it was an emblematic room because of heraldical questions. Christine of France was French, so the lily was the typical coat of arms of the French monarchy. And the connection between the two rooms is extremely interesting because the one in which we enter is the so-called rose room. Rose is not merely, again, a flower, but it was the coat of arms of the Kingdom of Cyprus. And the family of Savoy, before becoming King of Italy, King of Sardinia, and before King of Sicily, were King of Cyprus. It was not a so relevant title, but anyway, it was the first crown they obtained. So the fact to connect, to combine the two rooms, which are narrow the one to the other, is symbolizing the merge between the two royal families, the one of the Bourbons, represented by the lily of France, and the one of Savoy, represented by, again, the rose. What is interesting in this case is the combining between the shape of the room, which is square, and on the contrary, the handing of the room itself, simulating the vault. It's just simulated because, as you can see, it's made in wood and stucco work. So it just gives the idea of the presence of the dome. secondo che aumento la luce. And we enter now the main center of the residence, being this big, but in fact not so big if compared to other castles and palaces, central saloon. At the beginning, the historians thought it was a ballroom, but in fact, if you could just consider the dimensions and also the decoration of this space, you immediately perceive it's a strange ballroom. It was much more a sort of official vestibulus in which the representation in panels, the fresco that we can see, in the architectural system given by the tortile columns and also the upper portion with the balcons, represent paintings and scenes in which the history of the family is shown. There are situations, battles, but not only battles, in which the royal family at that time, the ducal family of Savoy, is involved. And normally they are allied to the French. And this alliance is also represented by the presence of dog. You can recognize dog everywhere, even in the middle of the battles or in contrast, because they were a symbol very used during the 17th century to symbolize fidelity and devotion. So again, the room is extremely symbolic. Since the beginning, which means the central door, we must consider that the court and also the visitors used to enter by this door, and they immediately could perceive the coat of arms, in which again we have the composition between the lily belonging to the Bourbons and the extremely complicated court belonging to the family of Savoy, in which each of these elements represents one of the states composing, at the end, the state of Savoy. And at the top, as you can see, there is the crown. The crown is closed and superposed by the cross. The closure of the crown represents symbolically, heraldically, the obtaining of the title of king. So it is really the celebration. It is just the kingdom of Cyprus, if you want, but in any way, there is the final asset of the family inside the royal system of Europe. It is also the only room in the castle having real double level. It is higher than the rooms in which we enter, and also having a real vault. It is a very subtle vault, but anyway, it is in brick, while on the contrary, we have seen that the ceiling in all the other rooms were composed by levels in wood and stucco, simulating the idea of a pavilion. 2 words, if you want, on the Greek lighter. The lighter is not original. It was bought in Venice, arriving from a palace which had to be destroyed, transferred to the Valentino castle, and insert in this place. At the origin, we know there were, on the contrary, more reduced spaces to give light. There were chandeliers. There were not a system like this one. The floor, even if it is not original, it is a restoration floor. It is extremely interesting because it's simulating the original floor presented in the castle, which were all in tiles, like this one that you can see. The parquets, I mean the wooden element we have seen in the rooms previously, were introduced by the engineers in 1859 and the following years, at the moment in which the residence was transformed into this place for instruction, for the formation of engineers, so no more the residence of the family. On the contrary, at the moment in which this palace was really an official residence, like all the residents outside the city, the use was the use of these brick tiles. So even if they are of restoration, they represent perfectly the way we had the condition of the apartments. We can move if you don't have any interest. Questa sarà chiusa. Questa è chiusa, purtroppo, non importa. And we have entered the second apartment. The palace, as you can perceive, maybe we can have a look at the model, was composed by a central official portion, being this one, also represented by the presence of the two towers, one tower facing the Po and then the other facing the city, so the two towers that we can perceive even nowadays, and two other towers going on the direction of the city itself. As you can see from the model, the two back towers were higher than the one facing the city, to give really the idea of the perspective. The apartments in which we are all in this portion of the residence, and they represent the first level, this one. The apartments are organized starting from the main ballroom of Central Hall, or vestibulus as you prefer. We were in 2 minutes ago. This one is the golden, in which we were just last time, and this one, on the contrary, is the white one. The two apartments were organized to be, at the beginning, the apartment for the duchess and the apartment for the duke. The sudden death of the duke in 1737 transformed the original project into the apartment for the duchess and the apartment for the heir. So the apartment for the duchess is the one in gold. This one we just entered is the one in white for the heir. No strange, Christine of France was really a princess, so she had royal blood, while on the contrary, her son will be the future duke. So the use of the gold, as I was telling you before, is strongly connected to the condition of the duchess herself, while on the contrary, the use of the white is typical for the heir. And this apartment is clearly different from the previous. The shape, the organization of the spaces is exactly the same, but the decoration in this pale white, which is the typical color of the marble, is giving the idea of a completely different apartment, while on the contrary, the organization is absolutely similar. This is also the last room to be accomplished. So it gives you the idea also of the transformation of the taste. No more, if you want, the rigid element we have seen in the other apartments, composing mainly the ceiling, but this very, very soft way to unite the false vault to, on the contrary, the walls, which gives really the idea of a transformation of the taste. This residence is also so extraordinary because it has been abandoned by the court. It was too small to give place to all the court, which was becoming bigger and bigger and bigger during the 18th century. So the lack of interest by the family gave also the opportunity to the residents to maintain its original decoration, while on the contrary, the other was enormously transformed. And to perfectly demonstrate that the organization of the apartment is exactly the same, we entered this room, which is accomplished by another small cabinet, being exactly the same of the cabinet we have seen in the other apartment. This room is an extraordinary room, because if in the golden apartment we had all the emblems of Christine, and also, if you want, the narration of the life of Christine in perfect parallel to what was created in Paris for the mother of Christine, so Marie de Médicis, Mary of Medicis. And so the narration of the history of the life of the Duchess is also a way to establish the royalty and also the possibility to be regent, what Christine was after the death of her husband, in this apartment prepared for the heir, each room is involving a phase of the organization of the life of the prince to make him to be a good duke, and so if you want also a good king. And so the formation is represented. And this room is the so-called ant room, because ant, during the Ancien Regime, which means the 17th and 18th century, was considered to be the most prestigious activity for a duke or for a king if it was not on the battle champ or battlefield, if you prefer. So the ant, like a very royal activity. And the representation in this room is assuming quite a role of, if you want, extraordinary way to show also the ability of the master workers. The quality of the stucco work is extreme. You probably can see the second level of the frieze, the one in stucco, in which you have ribbons apparently totally detached from the backstage and sustaining the enormous triumphs of fruits. They seem to be totally suspended and detached from the backstage. But if you just move in the position in which I am and follow me, and you look at the triumph of fruit, you immediately perceive there is a metallic bar which is sustaining, and the ribbons themselves are formed by a marrow. The marrow is again metallic, and then it is covered by linen, and the linen is covered by the stucco. So it gives you the idea to be extremely aerial, but in fact there is a very technical system allowing the stucco to obtain this level of virtuosism. It is the same for the dogs at the top of the doors, in which you have the idea that the dogs are just coming from the backstage and arriving in front of you. Again, there is a sort of skeleton composed by metallic element, and then the plaster and the stucco gives the idea of the movement of the dog itself. The quality of the stucco work in this room is really superb. What was interesting also is that outside the window, and I just moved the curtain, no, not this one, this one. Outside the window, there is the botanic garden, or physics garden, which belongs to the university. This area was given to the university in 1739 to become really a botanic garden. But at the origin, this area was totally occupied by the preserve, the hunting preserve of the Duke, which means having the activity simulated in the room and the real activity, the hunt, outside of the window. This way to give portion of the residence, and better, of the gardens of the residence, to become the botanic garden, so given to the university, is extremely interesting because it gives the idea that the lack of interest by the royal family or ducal family for the residence because of the small dimension itself is combined to the transformation of the area, so the landscape, given to the university at the beginning and then to the city to form the Green Park, the Valentino Park in which we are. So the residence is given, we are now during the 19th century, to be the place for the engineers, so a school, and the park, the area around belonging to the original system of the residence is given to the city to become the park. So the transformation of the whole area. Well, I open the window of the main barrel and the wow effect is assured. You have the immediate idea of why this place was so loved by the royal family and by Christine of France herself. It is really a place in which you have a complete idea of being in the nature and appreciated the presence of the river. If we just go on the balcony, we see exactly the position in which we are. We must imagine also that there, exactly in front of you on the bank of the river, there was also the arriving of the official boat taking Christine and the court, so different official boats, to reach the area. They used it to come from the city, which is in this direction, on the river, then landing here, where there was a sort of harbor, and then reaching the downstairs level, in which there is a sort of vestibule, as we will see in a second, and then using the main marble staircases that you can see on the two sides, reaching the level of this under portion, and then using the main staircase we will use to go downstairs, we will see, and reaching the official apartment. What is interesting is that in this position we also have the idea of the area belonging to the court at the time of Christine of France. It was composed by the residents, it was also composed by the control on the river, and also by a portion of this hill area. The hills at the time of Christine of France were called the mountain of Turin, because the Alps, being really the mountains, were so far from the city that they could be perceived like a sort of crown surrounding the city. But the main perception of something remembering the idea of the mountains was represented by the hills. And the hills were not so densely habitated nowadays. There were just vineyards. Vineyards were not only the cultivation of the wine, but were also a place in which there were small residents. The court and the noble families used it to use, for example, during summer. It was a way to stay far from the city, in which, as you can imagine, there were epidemics, it was extremely hot, while on the contrary, the mountain was really a place of leisure. And from here, you probably can perceive there is a small portion of a yellow residence that you can see in the middle of the trees. This residence was at that time the vineyard owned by Christine of France. It was the so-called Vinea Montana. Vinea means vineyard, Montana obviously mountain. So the residence of Christine for the summer. And all the property was starting from the castle and also at that time the palace, and also the surrounding courtyard, orchard, etc., and the residence itself, and reaching this level of the hills. So it was a sort of continuous perspective. If we just look on this side, then it gives perfectly the idea of the relation with the city. You recognize there is a church at the top of the hill. This is the so-called Monte dei Cappuccini. It was a place under the direct protection of the ducal family, and so there was also again a visible connection, high connection between this residence and this element being an emblem of the control by the family of the city. And in the backstage, probably you can recognize there is Superga Basilica, which is on the contrary an 18th century insertion at the top of the hills, introduced by, at that time, really a king, Vittorio Amedeo II. And so you have really from here the possibility to perceive different elements composing the image of the city itself. And nowadays this is the park in which everybody can have a walk or use bike. It is extremely used by the population. And since the moment in which it was given to the municipality, the idea was to have a place in which the population could have a leisure. And we have also the foundation, for example, of rowing clubs to use the banks of the river, to use the water itself. So to create a sort of area in which the population could refresh, could have leisure, etc. And now, from the apartment, if you want to use in an inverse way, because this was the main area, the main room in which we were just 1 second ago, we have the perfect perspection of the way the visitor used to enter the official apartment. Passing through this that we call, using an Italian word, but using also in the English history of art, loggia, which means it is a sort of covered terrace, extremely aerial, in which you have the perfect perspection of what was the inner courtyard, the official ducal courtyard, this one in which we are, and the relation between this space and the city. We must consider that at the time of Christine of France, and for a long period, the city was extremely far from this place. We were in the middle of a system of orchards, so a productive area, and the connection with the city was quite not existing because of the fact we were in the middle of the countryside. And that time also, the residence was completely closed because instead of the aerial gate that you can see nowadays, there was a semicircle, so the middle of a circular system in bricks, with at the center a small tower, exactly like what you can see even nowadays in Venaria Reale, in which you have the closure. So the courtyard was a completely closed space reserved to the court, and the only possibility to perceive the countryside was from the level in which we are now. Before the arrival of Christine of France, anyway, at the moment in which this residence was owned again by a female member of the family, being the natural daughter of the first duke who decided to have Turin as a capital, which was the famous Duke Emanuele Filiberto that you probably have heard, the residence was given to this natural daughter, Maria, and who got married with an important member of another famous family, Este. Este was a family of the north of Italy. They decided to transform not the residence, but the connection between the residence itself and the city, requesting the building of this alley. When I use the term alley, I mean a boulevard in which the trees are really a relevant element, exactly like what you can see. If the two straw of trees are not clearly the original one, anyway, the organization is exactly the one wanted by Maria, the natural daughter of the Duke, and her husband. And this boulevard, or alley better, exactly at the center of the facade, was connecting the residence, this level of the residence, and another element that you can see at the end of the boulevard, again in yellow, which was a monastery. The monastery of San Salvario. Salvario being a corruption of the name Salvatore, which gives also the name to the area, the urban area in which we have the San Salvario quartier or San Salvario district. It is extremely relevant, this connection between because the monastery is at the end of an important street, being perfectly orthogonal, and you can see also there are movement at the backstage. This street is relevant because it was the original connection between the south gate of the city, so the gate in the fortification, and the direction going to Nice, nowadays in France. At that time, on the contrary, Nice was part of the territorial belonging of the family, and it was the port, the harbor, if you prefer. I mean, the natural port and the artificial harbor, both for the commercial and the military use of the family. So it was one of the most important paths connecting the city to the territories. And even nowadays, this street is called Via Nizza. So it is the connection really between the residence and the city. A city which was growing after the presence of Christine of France, enormously growing during the 19th and the 20th centuries. And this explains why, at the moment in which this place started to be the house, I will say, of the engineers, the relation with the city was changing. And so the ancient semicircular system with the tower was demolished and substituted by the aerial gate to allow the city to perceive that this place was a place of formation, was a place of school, was the place in which, if you wanted, the intelligentsia of the city was formed. The system is also interesting because it contains the main staircase that we use to go downstairs. The staircase is in white marble, as you can see, but there are also elements like the columns or the pyramids in a very particular marble. It is in fact technically a breccia, which means a mixture of sand and inclusions of marble with this color, beloved during the 17th century and arriving from quarries in Switzerland. And all the elements in this particular stone were moved using a fluvial system. They moved from the lake to the river to land, exactly like the court with its own boat, in this area, and then to be erected to compose the organization of the staircase. The same marble that I was describing on the staircase is used also for this room, called column room, in which, as you can see, there are 6 columns in this breccia, and so-called ancient Switzerland breccia, being monolithic columns, inserted to sustain the closure by the ceiling, which is a vault, a real, again, vault, because we are exactly downstairs in consideration of the main ballroom in which we were previously. You must imagine that at the time of Christine of France, the windows closing now the space were not present. So it was really a filter, again, between the outside, represented by the banks of the river, and the great staircases in marble we have seen from the balcony at the upper floor, and this level. At the origin, because before the arrival of Christine of France, this level, the ground floor, was the official level of the residence, while on the contrary, with the arrival of Christine and the new protocol of the court, the main apartments were on the first floor, and this ground floor was used for the services, which means the kitchens, means also the bedrooms, because nobody used to sleep in the area upside the stairs, while on the contrary, if they wanted to have a rest, they could use the spaces at this level. And this vestibulus, this was its function, was really also a way to make an exaltation of the family. As you can see from the clipeus, this is the official name, which are these sort of niches surrounded by the elements of leaves and vegetables, in which there are some representation of emperors, Roman emperors. These bustos of Roman emperors are really Roman. They were bought on the antiquities shop in Rome by the father-in-law of Christine of France, the Duke Charles Emmanuel I, who really wanted to give the idea of a sort of imperial connection between the family of Savoy and the ancient Roman emperors. And there are 6 inside the room and 2 outside, as you can see. There is also a last element I wanted to show you, which is this portion of wall, in which we can recognize during the restoration, this element appearing, the origin of the house, the palace, which was in fact smaller and smaller than what we see nowadays. It was just a small residence facing the river with the typical 16th century decoration. So this was an outside wall, then becoming an inside wall because of the project wanted by Christine of France, with the insertion of the main staircase, the redoublement of the towers, both facing the river and both facing the city, and then the final reorganization wanted by the engineers, which means the second level for the lateral wings that we can perceive immediately, obviously reproducing the decoration of the ground floor, so simulating was since the origin so big, and then the lateral brick wing we have seen from the windows at the beginning of our visit. This is the new way in which the residence is recomposed, and since the last phase of the 19th century, it starts also to be called Valentino Castle. So no more residence, but Valentino Castle. Just two words about the origin of this name, Valentino, which is strange. You can find in bibliography some amazing interpretation. So, for example, Valentino because of the presence of the chapel dedicated to Saint Valentine. No, nothing found of this. Or from Valentina, a member, feminine member of the family. No woman having the name Valentina. On the contrary, is a corruption of a Latin expression vallum ante imum, which means exactly the topographical condition in which we are. It's a sort of platform having a subtle slope. You perceive there is a difference of level between the top of the gate and the area in which we are, and then again a subtle slope going to the river. Vallum, so something elevated, looking to a lower portion, the river. Vallum ante imum. Corruption, Valentinum, Valentinum, Valentino. So the nowadays term used to describe this area. Well, we moved from the castle into the nowadays park. We must consider that all the area was belonging to the green spaces around the residence, but nowadays it is really completely different. The perception we have, it is the park of the city, and normally the entrance is represented by this arch, so-called marble arch, like the what we have in London, for example, surely reduced in dimension, but anyway using all marbles arriving from Piedmont, from the area, introduced during the 19th century, obviously, to merge the relation between the green area, the alleys that you can perceive that they are moving to the city following the banks of the river, and the relation with the hills, again, with Monte dei Cappuccini we were seeing from the balcony, and this bridge. This bridge is fundamental because it is the connection between the two banks of the river, relating the hill on one side and the city on the other. And this big alley or avenue, if you prefer, being Corso Vittorio Emanuele II, was the limit of the ancient city. It was a sort of the area outside the fortification, and then became, during the 19th century, the main axis connecting the city from the east, the river in the east position, to the west. So the direction to France, where there is the Moncenisio, so the passes, the alpine passes connecting the Piedmont area and the mountains, and so even the France, and so being, even nowadays, one of the most used boulevards in the city. And from here, we will follow this street, Corso Cairoli, which is again a boulevard, which is facing the banks of the river and leading, so reconnecting this portion of the city to Piazza Vittorio, where is the place in which we will stand again, because Piazza Vittorio represents the other important bridge connecting the city with the hills. The most ancient bridge, because it was present since the Roman time, not the one we will see nowadays, but anyway, it represented the only place in which it was possible to pass the two elements, natural elements, represented by the slope again of the city and the banks of the river, to reach the hills, so the mountains of the city. This bridge is surely more recent, but since the moment in which it was built, it became the main reliance between the two portions of the city itself. We must also consider that all this area, the park, was used massively since the second half of the 19th century for the exhibition, international exhibition. We had, for example, the Expo in 1884, then the following to celebrate the 50 years of the unification of Italy in 1911. And so a series of exhibitions, and the bridge was fought in itself in the center of this exposition area of 1911. So it became, since that time, the moment in which the city is reconnected. We reached this place following the river because it's really the place in which we can have the perfect perception of the question of the bridge I was trying to describe 2 seconds ago. There we have the bridge I described to you, the one at the end of Corso Vittorio Emanuele II. So the bridge realized at the beginning of the 20th century, being nowadays the preeminent. And if we turn on the other side, we have the other bridge, which is the so-called Napoleonian or Napoleonic bridge, the one built by Napoleone Bonaparte, really, during the ephemerous period in which the city was belonging to France, and projected by Laramé Pertenchamp, who was an engineer of the Pont-et-Chaussée school in Paris. This bridge is extremely important because it is also called the Stone Bridge. It is the first moment in which the Napoleonic period the city has an official bridge, not in wood, so being permanent, not destroyed by the flood of the river. And so this bridge represented really a moment in which, as I was telling you before, we have a reconnection between the two banks of the river. Turin is organized with 5 main bridges. These 2 are the most ancient, with another third we can see being on the other side. And the connection is also relevant because, as you can see, there are the rowing society. For example, this one that you can see is one of the ancient rowing society. There is another on this side, so representing this leisure use of the river since the second half of the 19th century. And at the top of this small hill, because there are different level of the hills, as you can perceive also in the perspective, is the one with the Monte dei Cappuccini that we were seeing also from the balcony of the castle. In the very, very backstage, you have Superga Basilica. From here, probably, you can appreciate also the relation. The position of Superga is extremely relevant. It was chosen because it is really preeminent in relation to the city, so it represented a sort of evidence of the royal family of Savoy, wanted by Vittorio Amedeo II, as I was telling you, in relation to the city itself, being the capital since 1572. So continuously, Turin is the capital of the states governed by the Savoy since 1562 to the transfer of the capital to Florence in 1864 and then to Rome, as we all know, in 1871. We reached now Piazza Vittorio, which is the way Turinese people normally talk about this enormous space. At the moment in which it was realized, we are in 1826, it was the biggest square in Europe. It was thought to be what we say an army place, a place for the parades, military parades of the army, which explains the enormous dimension of the wall system. The square is also again facing the river. River Po is crucial for the city. And we are exactly at the center of the bridge, the Napoleonic bridge, reconnecting the two banks. At the end, in the perspective, you see there is a very big church. This is the so-called Gran Madre di Dio, which means the Green Mother of our God. So it is devoted to Our Lady. This is a votive church. As you can see also on the frieze, there is a Latin written motto which says Ordo Populusque Taurinus op adventum regis. It means the population of the city of Turin, for the coming back of the king. It is the typical sort of memorial building celebrating the restoration of the monarchy of Savoy after the Napoleonic phase, which is quite strange because we have exactly on the same axis the bridge representing the emblem of the engineering skills during the Napoleonic phase, and the church, which is on the contrary the emblem of the coming back of the kings during the restoration. It is also the center of a small square that you probably can perceive, being the center of this borough called the Po Borough. It is one of the ancients of Turin, two ancient boroughs on the two banks of the two rivers, the River Po and the River Dora, were the two productive areas of the city. Nowadays it is a very, very chic place to live in, with extremely expensive houses, but this nowadays condition is deriving from the transformation introduced by the building of the votive church and the 19th century new city building. But before this organization, when there was only the wooden bridge, this area was merely an industrial, the 18th century idea of the factory for the city. While on the contrary, the other borough on the banks of the River Dora was an area of mills. So it was the more production connected to the food, the feed of the city. The other side of the square, extremely neoclassical, is the triumph of the urban organization by the architect Frizzi, who solved a topographic matter. As you can perceive, the square is not exactly flat. There is again a slope from the beginning of the street, Via Po, we will walk on, and the position of the river. The slope is at 6 meters. So the volume of the square had to combine the idea of the facade continuity, so the urban image, with the necessity to combine the different levels of the houses itself. And the genius solution is the use of the element with the tympanon, which are creating a sort of filter between the different facades and represent the central block, the block of the building, in relation with the other lateral blocks. There are also terraces, as you can appreciate. The terraces are again a filter, closing the place in which the streets arriving from the ancient city, this side, and the new city built during the 19th century, the one facing the park in which we were 10 minutes ago, are creating a sort of continuity passing through the city, while on the contrary, the curtains give you the idea it is totally closed. At the end of the square, there is an Isidra again, so a semicircular solution. This Isidra was rebuilt during 1826, so redrawn by the architect Frizzi, but is an ancient Isidra because even when we had the fortification, the so-called fortification à la moderne, which means with bastions, ravelin, moat, etc., so the extremely fortified solution of the city, this was the place in which the city ended, and there was the great Po gate, which was the one facing the river. So even if the Esidra we see nowadays is a 19th century solution, it reflects perfectly the way in which, since the 17th century, the city used to finish the fortification and having the gate. We move a little in the square. As I was telling you, the square is enormous, so it's a long way, and also it's a slope to reach the beginning of Via Po, but Via Po is surely a fundamental element because it is the connection, and we can see in perspective from here with the castle that you can see at the end of the square and even of the street, and the river itself. We are walking in Via Po, this very, very long street I was telling you, connecting the river with the center of the city represented by the Royal Square. But the street is not only a continuous curtain. Again, we have different streets connecting the ancient part of the city with the other expansion of the city itself. And here we can perfectly perceive this condition. If we go on the left, we are in the direction of the river Dora, so the second river of the city. If we look on the contrary on the right, we are again in the direction leading to the Parco del Valentino, in which we were sometimes ago. The street, Via Po, is extremely homogeneous in the facade, as you probably have perceived, while it's totally different in the streets arriving to the road. So it is really a continuous system, as you probably can appreciate, of vaults, the classical 17th century vaults, in which each element, even the churches, like for example this one we are just seeing, are totally inserted in the general context. While we will see, just in a few walls, another church being previous than the realization of the street, which is the only one having its own small square, defining a different space in comparison to the other, insisting and wanted also continuity. This street was extremely famous also for the travelers. It was realized starting from 1672. There is a specific request by the Duke, which was Carlo Emanuel II, who wanted to expand the city in the direction of River Po, and requested to have this street with absolute continuity. If you will see a map of the city, you will realize that the street is not exactly orthogonal to the city, but is really a sort of diagonal. This condition is wanted since the beginning because the street is not a new creation, but is the rectification of an ancient historical path, the one connecting since the Roman age, obviously then transformed by the passing of the centuries, the center of the city represented by the fortification, the Roman walls of the fortification, and the direction again on the river. So we see the redrawing during the second half of the 17th century of the ancient connection between this center of the city and the river. We move a little. We have also to consider that this homogeneous aspect of the road by the facade, the continuous facade, as I was telling you, was remembered by the travelers having two possible considerations. Some of them consider it was extremely elegant, it represented also the modernity of the city, while others complained it was extremely boring, because each palace was exactly the same of the other, so it was quite impossible to distinguish the different portion of the blocks. It is quite true, because if you walk under the colonnades, like what we are doing now, you really perceive there are the big portals, the big gates of the different palaces, but you don't perceive this is a palace different from the following. Each of these palaces is quite big. They normally have courtyard, inner courtyard, because each of them form really a block. So it is both a building, but also, if you want, a urban organization of the city. This expansion is in fact an expansion in which the dimension of the different blocks is quite relevant, giving the opportunity both to realize a series of urban palaces, like the one we are walking down, but also sort of small urban villas, which mean the palace at the center of the block having a front courtyard and a backstage garden, which was a typical solution of the 17th century, again deriving from the French model. It is what is called the model of the Palace entre cour et jardin, which means exactly the palace between the main official courtyard and the garden. On this road, since the beginning, I mean since the moment in which it was established, there were also a series of palaces in which, even if the facade was exactly the same of the other, there were different functions. We will see in a second. We just stop here at the corner with Via Montebello, because you can appreciate the famous Mole Antonelliana, which is probably the emblem of the city. Sorry. Passi pure. Grazie. The emblem of the city, realized by the architect and engineer Antonelli, at the moment in which it was realized to be the Jewish synagogue of the city. It was the tallest building not only in Turin, but in a great portion of Europe, totally in brick. So no reinforced concrete, but just brick to form the structure. Never accomplished and never used as the Jewish synagogue, became property of the municipality and is now the seat of the Museum of the Cinema. Very few people know that Turin was also the capital of the cinemascope, and that there were a lot of firms in Turin being pioneer of the use of the cinema. Obviously the black and white, grazie, the black and white and the mute cinema. Move. These palaces, in which there were different functions, are partially recognizable from the street itself, but immediately recognizable if we reach the courtyard. And the first one was a place for the orphanings, and is exactly the place in which we are now transformed. And the following that you will appreciate because of the very rich inner courtyard with the double system of columns and balconies is the place in which was founded the university, the Turin University. And it is even nowadays the place in which sit the dean of the rector, better, of the university itself. We will reach it in a few minutes walk. We reached the church I was describing you, the ancient church of Saint Francis, San Francesco da Paola. Previous than the realization of the road, so you immediately perceive that the block is organized exactly like the previous and the follower on the two sides of the church, but the facade is absolutely the previous facade, beginning of the 16th century, with its own very, very small sacred square in front. It is a sort of anomaly, if you want, in the continuity of the Wall Street. We continue. And we reached the university. This is the lateral portion of the enormous palace occupying an entire block in which the university is sit. And on the back, you see there is written Cavallerizza. This was part of the first Duke and then Royal Palace. We will see in a second. It was the place in which there was the Cavallerizza, which means the horse trading, and also the school for the member of the court, at the service of the Duke and then the King. So it is part of this enormous, it's what we call the commander area, in which there are both the palace, but the church, the library, the ministry, etc. We move and we reach the university.
Non so come fai a resistere.
Oggi è tremendo.
Mamma mia.
And maybe just a stop for the ladies. This is Musi, the jeweler of the crown. They were the official, there were any other, but in Turin they were the official furniture of the crown. And also, as you can see, if you want the armchair containing the windows of the jewelry remains like it was during the, obviously, 19th century. And they are close to Piazza Castello that we are reaching now. Piazza Castello is the absolute center of the city, in which we have many and many elements deriving from different periods. Very recognizable, the castle, of which we can see the medieval appearance, being the transformation in a castle with the shape of what we call the carré savoyard, which means the square solution with the towers and the courtyard at the center, which is the transformation wanted by the Acaia. Acaia were a lateral branch of the Savoy family in the period in which they were the master of the city. The transformation of the ancient Roman gate of the city. So in the courtyard there are still the archaeological evidence of this Roman origin, and then the transformation in the medieval ages into the defensive, so real castle in the military sense of the city. A city that at that time stopped, in fact, in this position. While continuously in brick, the other portion of the square, being the back of the square, is represented by the organization again of the government area, the government headquarters, with from the royal palace, we will see in a second, the royal library with the royal collection belonging to the family, then the secretary, so the administration of the state, other ministry, finance, for example, and then on this orthogonal portion, again in bricks, the royal theatre, nowadays Teatro Regio, where we have the representation, lyrics, ballets, etc. That nowadays is transformed, obviously, after the great fire, with Molino's famous architect Molino inner area, but that at the origin, in his original organization, was even represented in the encyclopedia, because considered to be one of the most modern technologically, again, theater in Europe. What is interesting is that all this system is again continuous. It was possible for the king, for safety reason, but also ceremonial reason, to move directly from the palace to the theater, never going outside the system of the palace. And it is one of the reasons we call this the government area or command headquarters. At the origin, the square was totally closed. So the nowadays side of the royal garden is a recent opening between the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th to connect again portion of the city, while on the contrary at the origin this system was totally closed because the gardens were really privy gardens, the one connected to the residence of the royal family. The other side, with the porches, reflects the organization wanted by the Duke of Savoy at the moment in which they started the enlargement of the city. All the three main enlargements of the city start from this center. The one we have seen, the enlargement facing the Po, in which Via Po is the main axe. The other, on the contrary, facing south, of which Via Roma is again the main axis, we will see into second. And then the last one in the other direction, the west direction, in which we have another axis we will not see. So the idea of the porches was wanted by the ducal family since the moment in which they decided to establish the square to be the center of the development of the city. The porch considered to be a filter between the private property represented by the different block of apartments, normally also apartment to be let, so for rent, and the official, on the contrary, a component of the square belonging to the court. So since the disposition by the Duke, we are at the end of the 16th century, all the palaces facing the square were requested to have porches to allow the population, the noble better, to assist also the ceremonies led in the center of the square. From this position you can perceive also the first skyscraper, the so-called Torre Littorian Tower, wanted during the regime period, so we are between 1922 and 1943. This element was considered extremely foolish and totally outside the organization of the city, and this is the reason it is also called by the bibliography of the time the finger on the city. So like if it was a finger standing on the city. In fact, it belongs to a redrawing of a portion of the city, we will understand in a second, in which really the idea of modernity was trying to merge with the idea of contemporaneity given by the continuity, the absolute continuity of the square. We just move a little. From this position, you can appreciate very well the way in which the ancient castle, the medieval castle, with this solution, the square shape, the four tower, and the inner courtyard, is connected to the extraordinary transformation added by Filippo Juvarra at the moment in which the castle became Palazzo Madama, where the name Madame Palace is connected to the use by the two royal madams, the one Christine of France, the same we have seen at the Valentino Castle, who started to use the castle and transform into a palace for her residence, and then the second transformation requested by her daughter-in-law, Marie-Jeanne Baptiste of Savoy-Nemours, who was the widow of the Duke Carlo Emanuele II, who requested the Juvarra to insert again an enormous staircase and a great ballroom, in this case it's really a ballroom, to redefine the wall system, and lived for 40 years in this palace, then transformed really in a comfortable palace after the end of her regency. She was regent for her son. And here it is really clear how the portion of the ballroom, the staircase, and the new facade is attached to the medieval complex. We will appreciate in a second this extraordinary facade by Juvarra, if we just move around. Andiamoci alla pirateria. And from here, you can also appreciate this other diagonal, this street, called Via Pietro Micca. The street was opened in the last quarter of the 19th century, using the so-called Legge di Napoli, the Naples law, a state law established after the last great cholera epidemic in Napoli, the law dating of 1885, allowed to cut really the ancient tissue of the city for sanitary purposes, which mean the redrawing of the city, substituting the ancient houses with new modern. And so this street has a diagonal, so if you want interrupting the orthogonality of the city, was both a sanitary reorganization and also an economical way to redraw the city at the moment in which, as I was telling you many times ago, the city was lacking official role as a capital and was reinventing as an industrial capital. So the street was very commercial with great apartments for the leading entrepreneurship, new way of interpreting the city. And again, it is a long street, as you can see, with porches, reconnecting the center of the city with another new square, being in fact an ancient square, totally redrawn again at this phase. And then in very backstage, you can also appreciate the Alpine chain, so the very far mountain, which is in contrast, if you want, with the closest mountain of Turin, represented by the hill. Questo non si vede mai, è un momento di luminosità eccezionale. Okay. On this side, the facade by Filippo Juvarra. You probably know the famous architect Filippo Juvarra, who studied in Rome at the school of Carlo Fontana and was met by the new king of Sicily, Vittorio Medio II, in Messina, and then transferred to Turin, transforming also for many aspects the aspect itself of the city, and introducing this facade I was describing. The facade, which is leading to the central courtyard, in which we have the archaeological evidence of the ancient gate, is perfectly in axe with this other street called nowadays Via Garibaldi, one, previously Contrada di Dora Grossa, and previously the Decumanus, so the ancient way of the city, demonstrating the Roman origin of the capital. The drawing that you see nowadays of the city, again very homogeneous, very continuous, even if you want boring, as the visitors say, is given by the redrawing in the second half of the 18th century, a moment in which again there was a redrawing of the ancient block belonging to the Roman city and the transformation of this continuous series of apartments, again for rent. Exactly in front of us, the Royal Palace. At the beginning, Ducal Palace, wanted by the second Duke living in Turin, Charles Emmanuel I, who requested a new palace for the court, so a big building. At that time, again, totally closed. There was not an isidra like what we have seen at the Valentino Castle, but anyway an enclosure in brick, again with at the center a small tower, so that we had two royal square, this portion called the Castle Square and the other called really the Ducal Square. So a separation between the two functions. Like what happened in the Valentino Castle, we have during the 19th century the transformation of the ancient enclosure in bricks by the new gate, by Pelagio Palagi, an extraordinary neoclassical composition, which again involves a more wide communication between the city and the palace. Anyway, I catch your attention on the gate of the palace. It is nothing extraordinary except for the fact that this gate is exactly in axis with this road called Via Roma. Again, for the ladies, the place in which you have boutique and boutique and boutique. This road, anyway, is nowadays a road with porches. After the transformation introducing during, again, the 20 years of government by Mussolini, in which the street was redrawn and rebuilt, also enlarged, inserting new palaces with porches, but the street is the oldest street wanted by the family of Savoy to draw the enlargement facing south, and the street ending by, you perceive immediately, this sort of dome, being the dome of the railway station, Porta Nuova, was at the beginning. We are between the end of the 16th century and the first 20, so the second decade of the 17th century, a military road, exactly protruding this virtual line between the gate of the palace and the new fortification, which means the new Porta Nuova, not the station obviously, but the gate in the fortification alla moderna. So the position is extremely relevant, and you really perceive that everything of the expansion of the city is reconnected to the art of the city, represented by this space. If we just move, I don't know exactly how, probably this way, we can reach this small courtyard reserved to the court, which is also the way to recognize this church being the ducal church of St. Lawrence, San Lorenzo, which was also the ducal chapel, so the official church of the palace. There are small chapels in the palace, but the official chapel of the palace is this one, in which you recognize the dome, but there is not a classical facade of a church. It is again a palace. There is a sort of continuity of the palace. If you don't perceive the presence of the dome, you just think it is the continuity of the lateral wing of the ducal palace. But you also perceive the extraordinary dome by Guarino Guarini of the Holy Shroud Chapel. The Holy Shroud is the most venerated relic belonging to the family of Savoy, and the chapel of the Holy Shroud was really the organization in an official chapel of the presence of this relic inside the royal palace. Passing through these arches, we reach another small square, which is in fact the lateral square. There is somebody. Okay. The lateral square of the cathedral. We have this side represented by the lateral nave of the cathedral, and this portion still belonging to the system of the royal court, because it's palazzo, a palace connected to a lateral member of the family, the brother of the duke, and then the king. So it belongs to the system of the court, and also you perceive that the cathedral is directly connected to the palace, and the filter between the cathedral and the palace is the chapel of the Holy Rood. So there is a continuity: the palace, Palazzo Chiablese, the cathedral, the Holy Rood. In the whole system, again, it's why we call command area, the system in which everything is reconnected, both the noble element and the religious component, all together. The cathedral is a Renaissance cathedral, conserving some more medieval elements, like the windows at the second level, as you can perceive, as which will be absolutely extraordinary in a very medieval or even Roman city. It was a touch of modernity, if you want, this very classical, very Renaissance solution for the cathedral. On the other side of the cathedral itself, rebuilding of a portion of the royal palace. During the 16th and 17th century, there was a branch of the palace perfectly parallel to the clock tower, demolished at the end of the 19th century, and during the rebuilding of this new wing that you immediately recognize is late 19th century. During the rebuild, excavation for the foundation of the new wing showed the presence of the Roman theater of the city. So you immediately perceive why we said we have in the center of the ancient city transformed by the intervention of the royal family before ducal family. Because the castle we have seen, then Palazzo Madama, was the transformation of the ancient gate, and here we have the remains, the ruins of the Roman theater transformed like garden elements into this portion of the rebuilding of the lateral branch of the palace. And it is quite normal that the theater is in this position, because if we look on the other side, we have the Roman gate, the other Roman gate. So all this area was the archaeological area of the city. demonstrating again this Roman origin of this not so big settlement, being extremely strategical on the contrary because of the presence again of the Alpine passes going to France. And nowadays we have an archaeological park in which the gate is contained. You perceive the gate. It was again an interesting solution. This is the gate represented by two towers. The towers are orthogonal, and no, maybe octagonal. Octagonal. The towers are octagonal, all in brick, and they were considered to be quite relevant for the military, also defense of the city. They follow quite well also the prescription in Vitruvius treaty. But we must consider that at that time, the moment in which Turin is founded, this area was in fact pacified. So there was no reason to build such military evidence for the city. But the reason is that this city, like other in this area of Piedmont and Valley of Aosta, were strategic. They were considered a sort of emblem of the entrance from the area, of the Celtic area, into the area, on the contrary, governed by the Romans. And so all these cities were extremely emblematic in the foundation, but also in the choice of elements representing, being emblem in a sort of the Roman pacification of this area. And this was the limit of the ancient city. And if we go down, we don't do, but if we go down the street, we reach the Dora, the second river I was telling you. And so we have also the perception of how this borough, the one of River Po and the one of River Dora, represented the productive area of the city, outside the limit of the city itself, outside the gate, but anyway strongly connected with the city because they were the official economical area of the city. On the other side, on the contrary, if we look exactly opposite, you see this enormous white building. This is the seminary, and it is a great building facing the other portion of Palazzo Reale, so the Royal Palace, so demonstrating that also this portion, having the church at the center and the remaining of the Roman antiquity, was part of the center itself of the city. It is probably the oldest portion of the city itself, because we must also consider that in the area, in parallel to the Roman remainings, there were also the early Christian remainings. The cathedral that we see from the other perspective is the rebuilding of a system of 3 basilica belonging to the early Christian period, of which we have also evidence by a mosaic found during the last restoration, which is just in this corner. The mosaic was found during the restoration and demonstrating this ancient use. There were the 3 great basilica, there were also the cemeteries for the priests, so this area was strongly related with the antiquity of the foundation of the city itself. And from this gate, again, we re-enter the area of the palace, again demonstrating the continuity between this portion. The mosaic is under this element. And by this door, we enter this sort of corridor leading to the main courtyard of the royal palace. The courtyard itself, it's a filter. If we go right, we go to the square. If, on the contrary, we go left, and it's what we will do in a second, we enter the garden. This area, again this green area, being the property of the palace itself and representing, like it was common in each of the residences, so like what we have seen for the Valentino Castle, the area of gardens strongly connected with the residence itself, and you have a perspective on the gardens. This was also the limit of the fortification city, what is demonstrated by the presence of an ancient ravelin that you can perceive on the back side in the other portion of the trees. The ravelin representing the fortification of the city itself. In this direction again we have the river Dora, and so demonstrating also, if you want, that this very central portion of the city nowadays, being Piazza Castello, the center of the city, was in fact very peripheric in the ancient organization of the city itself, because I was telling you it was the limit of the fortification, and the royal palace and this garden were exactly at the limit of this a la moderne fortification of the city itself, but also they were at the limit of the fortification of the Roman city, because we have just seen the gate. And this portion of the garden has just been restored and reopened to the public last year during the pandemic. And from here, you perfectly perceive what I was telling you, that we are at the top of a bastion, because there is an evident difference of level from this area in which we are and the street being on the other side of these buildings, the street representing the last part of the system of bastions and ravelins, where the city stopped and started the area again with the slope leading to River Dora and reaching this again big borough in which there were the mills, etc., so the fooding portion of the city. On the other side, the back of the royal palace with the emerging of the Chapel of the Holy Shroud with its own dome by Guarino Guarini. Questo commento per noi non è mica poi così male, tutto sommato.
No, no.
Bene, se credete adesso andiamo in Piazza Carignano which is the new facade for the new parliament. So the transformation during the 19th century with a new style, sort of neo-Baroque, defining the new use of the palace. And exactly in front of the new facade, we have a neoclassical facade. This was the area in which there were the stables of the palace, then transformed, and nowadays it's the National Library. The National Library, which is one of the oldest libraries we have, because it was established by the Duke and then King Vittorio Amedeo II to be a public library for the students of the university, being just on the other side, because this is again Via Po, in which we have the university, just the block parallel to the one we see. And this new National University Library, at the origin University and then National Library, was established with the collection of the king himself. And it's the reason we have in this National Library an enormous quantity of parchments, of ancient books, of manuscripts, and we have also one of the most relevant collection of manuscripts, music manuscripts by Antonio Vivaldi, and a great collection of drawing by Filippo Juvarra. They belonged to the Royal Ancient Collection. If we use this very French passage, this very French passage being a gallery, we have again the connection between Via Po, if you want, this small square being the back of the Palazzo Carignano, and just on the left, Piazza Castello, which means the center in which we have the Royal Palace. The passage was established, like all the passages, as a sort of commercial street, but covered with this vault, metallic vault, again, and windows, giving this extremely luminous ambience, in which a series of boutiques and also of ancient coffee, this is one of the ancients of the city, represented a way to use the city, which is quite cold in winter, also in the bad season. Having the possibility was typically French, so it represents a continuity, if you want, of what was realized in all the European capital at the same time. We are at the end again of the 19th century. And you perceive the relation of filter between all these squares around the absolute urban center represented by the Palace Square. And here we are. E questo sarebbe il deposito dei taxi, dove non c'è neanche un taxi.
Vuoi salutare il finale?
Cosa devo dirvi di finale? So thank you very much to everybody to have stayed with me for this very short tour in Turin. There will be many and many other things to see and to explore. So it's just an invitation, when possible, to come here and to have another turn in the city, another way to appreciate this city. And thank you very much, and see you again.